If you've turned on your TV or been to the movies or happened to be even remotely conscious over the last sort of 10 years, you will have probably come across Pedro Pascal. A few years ago, he seemed relatively well liked by people, delivering commendable performances in the stuff he's been in, and he's also come across as cool, charming, and likeable in his media appearances. However, all good things must come to an end because recently public sentiment towards him seems to have shifted, and that's probably something to do with the fact
he's everywhere. Everywhere. He's sitting at your desk, he's kissing your lover, he's eating supper with your family.
Before Pedro Pascal became Hollywood's go-to man for emotionally unavailable father figures, he gave us something genuinely unexpected. His character from Game of Thrones, Oberyn Martell, wasn't your typical stoic survivor. He was flamboyant, impulsive, and politically sharp. He moved with the swagger of someone who didn't just survive in the world he was living in, but dominated it. And Pedro Pascal delivered it with charisma, flair, and confidence. It was the kind of performance that hinted at an actor that had range, as well as an actor who could shift from being seductive to savage in an instant. His body language was expressive and his accent work was sharp, and his energy was volatile, but in the best way possible.
That all sounds lovely.
Indeed, all of the signs were really positive, but unfortunately that didn't last because after this role we never saw that type of performance again.
Oh, come on!
Because once Oberyn's head got squashed both narratively and perhaps symbolically, so did Pedro Pascal's chances to stretch that far again. After that role, it seems like Hollywood took one look at him and said, you know what, let's keep the charming accent but ditch everything else, and let's just only put him in roles where he's playing a protective man who might be carrying some trauma. Which brings us along to the rest of his body of work: The Mandalorian, The Last of Us, Narcos, Triple Frontier,
One eternity later,
Prospect, Kingsman, even Wonder Woman 1984, where Pedro Pascal effectively plays variations of the same character. Stoic, wounded, mysteriously fatherly. I'm just surprised Pedro Pascal wasn't in Empire Strikes Back or 28 years later. The man is just determined to be everyone's dad.
Daddy is a state of mind, you know what I'm saying? I'm your daddy.
Pedro Pascal's acting consistently gravitates towards a very specific, often repeated archetype. The character who's a little bit rough around the edges but also emotionally reserved. Take for example his role as Din Djarin in The Mandalorian. Pedro Pascal's acting opportunities are heavily restricted here. His face is hidden behind a helmet for pretty much the entire series. This creative choice places a lot of weight on Pedro Pascal's vocals and body language. That's if Pedro Pascal is even in the suit. Is he in the suit or not? I don't know. But anyway, regardless, vocally Pedro Pascal excels at conveying nuance through his vocals. However, the truth is much of the heavy lifting in creating emotional resonance is achieved through deliberate cinematography rather than Pedro Pascal's versatility. Filmmakers of The Mandalorian consistently deploy slow camera movements, as well as tight framing and lingering shots on subtle gestures to artificially amplify emotional depth. And to be fair, Pedro Pascal is effective within these carefully constructed cinematic conditions, but the reality is that these filmmaking techniques can compensate significantly for acting limitations. And again, in The Last of Us, Pedro Pascal settles into familiar territory. Joel Miller is another character whose emotional range is intentionally muted. His character is obviously dominated by stoicism, grief, and suppressed anger. There's lots of moody lighting, close-ups that dwell on Pedro Pascal's expressive eyes, and slow, deliberate editing to highlight the emotional intensity. Honestly, just cue the scene from Shrek 2 where Puss in Boots does that wide-eyed look, because that's basically Pedro Pascal's emotional climax in his roles. The risk that comes with Pedro Pascal's limited emotional range is that audiences expect less complexity from narratives that feature him now. Much like how audiences expect every Jason Statham movie to be a variation of the same stoic, tough guy formula. Once an actor is strongly associated with a specific character type, the writers and directors often craft stories that orbit those familiar beats, rather than pushing for narrative or emotional depth. Pedro Pascal's choice of supporting roles is also revealing, as it often highlights his limitations rather than his strengths as an actor. In the Kingsman: The Golden Circle, Pedro Pascal portrayed a character called Agent Whiskey, a character much closer to his established acting skill set, a character who is rough around the edges, quite charming and mysterious. This role was crafted as a classic Western-style action hero, a cinematic archetype Pedro Pascal easily inhabits. The filmmakers amplified this by consistently framing Pedro Pascal in comfortable visual tropes. Wide-brimmed hats, leather jackets, revolvers, etc. Cinematographers frequently deployed close-ups of Pedro Pascal's expressive eyes, which reinforces his typical brooding, mysterious persona. And while this is visually appealing, this filmmaking choice inadvertently traps Pedro Pascal in a very narrow acting box. It tells audiences that Pedro Pascal is reliably predictable, a comforting choice, but one that severely limits narrative unpredictability. And again in The Equalizer 2, Pedro Pascal plays Dave York, a former CIA operative turned private contractor, and ultimately the antagonist. From the moment his character is introduced, it's clear that his character is cut from the same cloth as all of Pedro Pascal's other characters. He's competent, composed, morally mysterious, and carrying just enough personal history to suggest there's something deeper, even if the film never really goes there.
Boring!
Directors and cinematographers consistently frame Pedro Pascal in ways that amplify his acting strengths, which are elements of vulnerability and quiet intensity. Pedro Pascal's characters are often lit in moody, dim, or naturalistic lighting, a cinematic shortcut, if you like, for emotional complexity. And directors rarely challenge Pedro Pascal with roles that demand emotional or physical extremes beyond his comfort zone. At the end of the day, Pedro Pascal's undeniable charisma and consistent marketability are both his greatest strengths and his clearest limitations. In looking at his body of work, it becomes evident that Pedro Pascal isn't truly exploring diverse acting challenges. More so, he is frequently being cast into roles that are tailored to his established persona. Typecasting isn't necessarily the actor's fault alone. It's an industry-wide tendency where filmmakers and casting directors often prioritize reliability and predictability over artistic risk and exploration. What I've aimed to express in this video is not simply a critique of Pedro Pascal's acting, but rather an exploration of how actors and filmmakers alike become complicit in the cycle of typecasting. It's essential for actors and filmmakers to consciously challenge this dynamic to foster versatility and growth, because the danger is when audiences keep seeing Pedro Pascal everywhere, playing variations of the same role again and again, the very charm and charisma that made him bankable in the first place starts to wear very thin. If everything feels like a remix of something we've already seen, eventually people just stop watching. Not because the actor is bad, but because there's just nothing new that's left to see. And that's the blunt truth of it.